All right.
Hello, welcome to part two of our discussion, and we're talking about Olaudah Equiano. He was married. They had two children. One died when she was a baby. The other one got married to a pastor, and she did not have children. So Olaudah Equiano was a famous anti-slavery abolitionist and a brilliant writer. Why was his book so successful? Why do we still remember it?
I think we remember him out of guilt. I think his involvement in the abolition movement. You see, he wasn't just an abolitionist; he was a political radical. He joined the London Corresponding Society, which was a left wing organization in London. In fact, he lived in the same house rented from the guy who founded the London Corresponding Society. And what they wanted, first and foremost, is they wanted to expand the electorate because the number of people who could actually vote for, members of parliament was very small. And in some places, in some of the ridings, the number of people that actually could vote in the riding would be 20 or 30 people. That's all. You know, so they were electing a member of parliament, on the basis of what? And so the radical movement was to expand the electorate so that all the craftsmen, anybody who had a good job, only men, of course, that could vote, but at least and so he was involved in trying to expand the electorate for the House of for Parliament, the House of Commons. And when he's traveling on his book tours, selling books, and some people thinking making tons of money by selling books, when he's giving all these public lectures. He's not just saying what's in his book. He's out there and he's staying with people all over England, Scotland, and in Belfast in particular, who want to expand the Parliament electorate so that more people could vote, so that you didn't have these rotten boroughs where there was almost nobody who could vote, and so therefore Lord so and so could be elected again and again and again, and all these plantation owners from the Caribbean could keep getting elected, and so uh, so that's what he was doing. He was talking to all these people, about political issues. He wasn't just talking about his book. And besides, he sat in Parliament. We have evidence. He tried to testify in Parliament. They did not wouldn't let him testify, but they did accept a letter from him, which we have. It's very common knowledge. It's there, in which he explains, his opposition to the slave trade, because they had targeted the slave trade because most people in England didn't know how barbaric it was, and so that's what they thought as a public a way of raising issues, that they would attack the slave trade rather than slavery itself. Of course, he was opposed to slavery entirely, and this was only a first step. But so what is he doing when he's in Edinburgh? He's talking about slavery. He's not just talking about the slave trade. He's talking about Parliament, about how rotten it is because there's not enough people electing people. And he's talking about all kinds of issues, including economic development of Africa. And, he's smart. He's intelligent. And, he sat in on the parliamentary hearings, sat in the balcony. We have proof. He sat there. He listened to all of these, slave traders who were being interviewed by Parliament, Ambrose Lace, Penny, there are lots of them. That, he knew who all these guys were because he saw them. They're slave traders from Liverpool and from Bristol. He he's not stupid. So he's going out and he's talking about, this guy Ambrose Lace. He's lying through his teeth.
What's Ambrose's last name so our listeners can hear him? Can hear you.
Lace, Lace, Lace.
Okay.
His descendants became very wealthy in England. I can't remember all their businesses, but it was all initially based on money that they had earned as from the slave trade. And there's been articles, attacking the family and saying, this family really owes reparations because that's how you made your money, was initially out of the slave trade. Anyway, so our guy, Gustavus Vasa, is sitting in the balcony listening to all these guys. And in 1767, a little over a decade after Vasa left Africa as a boy, there was an unbelievably atrocious incident at Calabar. What happened was there were 6 British ships in the river, and they got into cahoots with some of the merchants at Calabar, and they massacred the other half of the town. It was a trade dispute. The slave trade was run by gangs. Huh? There's no difference between the gangs who, controlled drug trafficking or, human trafficking and girls and things like this. The way they operate, they have their own police force, they have their own operations, they do all things, and they're nasty guys. And that's what was happening in Calabar in 1767. Nasty guys killing, like Hell's Angels and the Bandidos having a war. So they had a little civil war within, and they killed about 400 people and enslaved about 600 people.
And be specific, you're referring to African slave traders, all right?
Yeah, both sides. We have
Yeah.
letters. I'm just publishing a book with.
But the 400, because the context is important. So Calabar had slave traders and 400 people were killed.
See, Ambrose Lace, who was the ringleader of the British merchants in this massacre, testified before Parliament. And he lied through his teeth. And there's Vasa sitting up there listening to all this and learning that A, there was a massacre, and 2, that these were the guys who did it, because he's not stupid. Huh? So what do you think he's talking about in Belfast and in Edinburgh?
And the people who died in the massacre, were these people slave traders or ordinary Africans?
No, the Liverpool merchants were white.
Yeah, the Liverpool merchants were white, and there was a massacre in Calabar.
Yeah, and the other half of the people who did the massacring were the merchants who lived in what at the time was called Duketown.
Oh, Duketown, okay.
And the Duketown merchants, it was all a trick. There was a dispute. The British merchants said, okay, let's get both sides on board ships so we can negotiate and we get over this crisis. That's not what they did. They got the people on board and they massacred one half of them. That's what they did. We have lots of letters. We're publishing these letters. We're just going to press with. We have a whole book of letters and correspondence.
And why? So the people who were on board, those are individuals who were going to be exported as slaves.
I'm not sure you can hear me.
I can hear you now. I can hear you.
You can hear me now?
Yes. So we're talking about the massacre, and I'm saying that people were on board and they were massacred, and I'm saying were those people African slaves?
Yeah. My point is that Vasa is sitting in Parliament in the balcony, and he's hearing all of these slave traders talk about the business.
Yes.
Now that's not in his book. That's not in his book. But you can't listen when he goes around England talking to everybody. You think of course, he talks about that. You know, he's a political activist. He was really left wing. He's not just an abolitionist. I mean, that was left wing too. I'm not saying it's not, but he was much more than that. He's a smart. You've read it. You've read his
Yeah, he's a smart.
autobiography.
He's really eloquent. He's really eloquent. But Gustavus Vasa was Igbo, and the Igbos are known for intellectual competence.
He was what? I'm
Because he
sorry.
was Igbo.
Because he was Igbo. Yeah, he
Yeah, the
was.
Igbos are known for being really smart.
Well, he was a smart Igbo.
Yes, and they are real estate investors. They like to buy houses. They're always landlords.
You can begin to see why he's called Loud Voice, because you can hear his mummy, when he was a kid, and she could never shut him up.
So did he talk about slavery in Africa?
Yes, extensively.
And what was his position on?
His family owned a bunch of slaves.
Yes, because his father was a senator. His father was wealthy. So what was his position on African slavery? What was his position on African slavery?
He said his father was a senator, which means that, I said there are the 4 clans that make up Equiano. It meant that he was a representative from the Aryan clan in the council of the 4 clans. That's what he was. That's important. I mean, on the one hand, the life in the villages there at the time was pretty simple. No electricity, it was, but nonetheless, we have descriptions, not then, but not in the 19th century, descriptions of the area. And the area was just beautiful. Avenues that go into the towns. It was safe, except that you had to worry about these people that would come around and steal children. That's what happened to him. They got stolen. He and his sister. They got stolen. That stealing of children was a problem among Igbo in particular, and in Bibio in particular, into the British period. And I have so many files from the Enugu archives all about child stealing. They confuse the children, of course. They steal the child, and so the child doesn't. Then they take the child, so the child gets lost. Child doesn't have any idea where he or she is. Can't get home. That's what you do. You blindfold them and you put them in a bag, and then you carry them for a while. They don't know where they are. They can never get home. And that was what they were doing right down into the 20th century in the British period. The British, one of the things the British had to do was to stop that, which they did. But
what about his sister? What was her name? Do we know her name?
We don't know her name. He doesn't give any. Unfortunately, he doesn't give name of mommy, daddy, of any of the siblings. It's too bad.
Oh yeah, that's what I've been interested.
Now, whether he did when he went on his speaking tours, he might have.
Yes, because at a lecture, there would have been an opportunity for members of the audience to pose questions.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And the other thing is, and I've done a collection of this, is the books he read. We know what he read because he tells us. Like he's a good historian, so he gives us footnotes. I've collected every single book, thanks to Anna's archive and Google, and things like that. I've collected every book that he read.
And tell us about some of these books. What were some of these books, the books that he read?
Well, the one that's most famous was a guy by the name of Anthony Benezet, who was a Quaker in Philadelphia.
Yes, I know that name quite well.
Yes, but Benezet never went to Africa, so he based what he wrote on what he read, and as an anti-slavery Quaker in Philadelphia. An educated man, no doubt about that, and very intelligent, no doubt about that.
Yes, but
And
Ben, this man Anthony, he was not 100% fond of blacks because I
hmm,
know I'm familiar with the literature on Anthony, so he was an abolitionist, but he wasn't really pro-black.
Anthony Benezet was a white guy.
Yeah, I know he was a white guy, but he's also a contentious guy because in the literature he's
Yeah.
presented as this abolitionist, anti-slavery activist. But when you read
Uh-huh.
the literature deeply, he didn't like blacks that much.
And he wrote a lot. And the thing is interesting for me is that at the same time, Vasa's master in Montserrat was a guy by the name of King. He was from Philadelphia, and he said he was a Quaker. So I'm
Okay.
really interested in how this all happened. I haven't fully figured it out yet, but I've been working on it. And anyway, um, uh,
Comment on the origin of the rumor that Basa was not born in Africa because you mentioned two publications in the UK that promoted that rumor that Basa was not born in Africa. The Star, that was the
well,
name
it
of
was
one, I
it was
believe.
the two documents. One document is
The Oracle
his
and the Star.
baptism, and that's in St. Margaret's Church, which is the church where the House of Commons met. Maybe they still do before they begin their sessions to have a morning prayer. It's right next to Westminster Cathedral, the big building. Huh? It's the smaller church that's next to it. They're both cathedrals, and they're both about the same age. They're very old, of course, and that's where he was baptized, which is a little bit unusual, but not entirely, because there are other blacks that were baptized there, and there's even a couple of marriages of black people that are recorded in the church. So it wasn't entirely unusual, but still it was a bit unusual that you bring in this boy who this is 1759. So by my calculations, and, he's now 17. That you bring him in and you baptize him, and because that's what he wanted to, because he had heard that if you became a Christian, you got out of slavery, which of course wasn't true, but it was widely, well, no, I don't know how widely, but if someone was a slave, they would take all kinds of risks, and if someone told you, well, if you become a Christian, you become free, he says, I'll try it. I'll try it. I'll do anything I can. And so he became a Christian. He was baptized. So he was baptized as Gustavus Vasa. And that's what it says in the thing. And it says that he was born in Carolina. But he didn't say he was born in Carolina. We don't know that he even knows what was written in the book. Oh, his
I
godparents.
I was
Godparents. They're the
Yes,
one who give the name.
yes.
Not, you don't ask the baby what's your name, baby? No, no, no. And if it's even an adult, you don't ask the person you ask the godparents. So the testimony is the testimony of the godparents. So the question is not, was he born in South Carolina or not? That's not the question. The question is, why did his godparents say that?
The Oracle and the Star both charge that rather than being born in Africa, Basa was born into slavery on St. Croix, a Danish colony in the Caribbean.
Yeah, well, that was a joke. British newspapers, especially at the time, they used satire. They made fun of everybody, and that was meant as a joke. Right at the time that was crucial in Basa's life, because he was in Edinburgh with his wife on honeymoon. The king of Sweden, Gustavus Vasa II, was just assassinated in Stockholm. This was just when the Danish parliament was passing an abolition law, the first one. Now, wasn't the Danish law wasn't supposed to didn't go into effect until 10 years later, but it's when it happened. So the two newspapers in London, they said, this is a good joke. We'll say, this guy, Gustavus Vasa, who everybody knew by then because he was famous. He'd become famous. He was well known. So the reading public who read the newspapers like crazy, they pick up the newspaper and here's the satire. Oh, Vasa, he wasn't born in Africa. He was born in a Danish colony. He was nothing more than a slave. He was not a king of Sweden. That was the joke. And you can imagine all these people laughing their heads off and Vasa getting really pissed off because they're making fun of him. Because he writes, he says, he renounces, he says, this is terrible, this is awful. You're upsetting my honeymoon. This is just when British Parliament is going to debate the abolition again. That's what they were doing. So the newspapers were playing with him. And they renounced it, of course, because it wasn't true. Of course it wasn't true. It was a joke. It was satire, British style. Nasty. Meant to be nasty.
Yeah, not different from today. The Daily Mail.
And it wouldn't have been nasty, and it wouldn't have mattered, and they wouldn't have done it except he was famous. Yes. The people had to know who the guy was. Well, there weren't that many blacks in London at the time, and there certainly weren't many blacks in London who were as smart as him or as articulate. And where he lived in Soho. He lived in just north of Oxford Street, right near Goodge Street Station. The church he went to was right there at Goodge Street Station. It's now called the American Church because during the World War, that was the center of the Eisenhower headquarters were really in a bunker across the street. They're still there today. So all the American servicemen, of course, went to church there. So it became the American Church. But originally, it was a Huntingdonian church. That's where he went to church. That's where he was buried. I'm telling you, it was. For me, Lipton is like one of the most emotional and funny things in my life because I've been to London a lot. I've sat in that little tiny park right next to Goodge Street Station so many times. I was sitting on where he was buried. He was buried in that little park. The crypt that he was in was moved in the 1890s, but that's originally where he was. And this was only discovered, when Equiano became really popular, and at the anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade, when the British people wanted to think they were heroes rather than villains. We're heroes because we abolished the slave trade, forgetting that they were villains because they started it. And they're the ones who owned all the slaves. Anyway, so here I am sitting like millions of people sitting in that little tiny park next to the underground station, time and time and time again, and walking past it and everything and not knowing he was there. But then when his name became popular, the guy in the church, the janitor, the person who looks after the church, he said, we got some old books here. And he found his name, Gustavus Vasa, in the book.
Interesting.
Yeah. So this is where he was born. This is where he's buried. Correct. No, we didn't know. No one knew this.
Where's Gustavus' house? Was it demolished?
I'm sorry?
Property, his house. His house.
I still don't understand.
Gustavus Vasa, where did he live? Was the property demolished?
He lived right around the corner. He lived right around the corner and that's where he wrote a good part of his autobiography.
And was the
That's where he
property
went to church.
demolished?
There's a plaque. There's a plaque on the building today.
Okay. Oh, okay. So it's still there.
Yeah.
That's good. Oh, it's still there.
Do you know Arthur Torrington? You must.
If I know what?
Arthur Torrington.
No,
He's the
I
head
don't.
of the Equiano Society. He's in London.
Okay, all right. So I know him
You know,
now.
you want to talk with that guy. He's cool. Arthur Torrington. You go online, Equiano Society.
Yes.
They
So
do a really good job. They do a really good job, and they're really fantastic. Well, Arthur, on several occasions, has he's given me what I call the Equiano tour of London. We went to every place where Vasa lived. Now, many places the buildings aren't there anymore, but the spot is there. And so I've gone with him all over London. Let me tell you, and to Plaisters Hall. We went to Plaisters Hall, and it was really funny because now today, of course, Plaisters Hall is this really tall, expensive high-rise. Huh? So we get into the offices. We get into the offices of Plaisters Hall, and we say to people in charge, they're saying, in the 1790s, this place was owned by a black guy, by an African. You know what their response was? These white people,
What?
they thought that was amazing. They loved it. They said, listen, when you finish your book, you come here. We'll launch the book from here.
What's the name of the book that you're writing now?
I'm writing a book on what are Vasa's slavery years.
Okay.
Only the years until 1766 when he bought his freedom.
Okay.
From where he was born, his time in Virginia, his time in the 7 Years' War, all of his observations on slavery. Because while he was lucky, man, he saw slavery. He saw it again and again and again. And he saw how cruel and how mean and how stupid and everything about. He writes about it. So I'm really interested in all of those observations, and really, in a sense, I'm interested in the development of his political consciousness, because he becomes more and more conscious. Because there was a period, he talks about it, there was a period when he thought it was possible to reform slavery. People treated people well, they fed them well, they let pregnant women have, normal birth instead of having to work right up until they give birth. And then, he thought, well, if you could do that. And then he came to realize you couldn't do it. And that's when he became a real radical and says, no, you just got to abolish this. You got to stop it.
Okay. So the British spent.
So that's the period I'm interested right now, is that period. The period from when he was born in about 1742 until he gained his freedom in 1766.
Yeah. The British spent over what, 12 million pounds to suppress the slave trade. So yeah, they helped to suppress, and many will say and have said there was the trans-Saharan slave trade, there was slavery in Africa. Other people were trading slaves before the British, because you said they started it.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons. That's a reason I'm a historian. I'm not interested in the past because of its beauty and glory. I'm interested in knowing the truth. Look, it's impossible to imagine or to think or to even to argue what would the world be like if we'd never had slavery. That's a false question. The truth is, we had slavery. We had a lot of it all over the world. That's how it happened.
No, Paul, I I want to speak to you briefly about this topic because I did not know that you're writing on Muslim slavery. You mentioned the name of a Muslim slave in Jamaica, and there this academic, he wrote an article about that slave. If in our correspondence, you said that the slave, he had descendants in Jamaica, and their last name is Peart. The Peart family was in politics in Jamaica in the PNP, Dean Peart and Michael Peart.
And it's Peart is a very, very unusual British name.
Yes, and let me give the name of the slave. Let me pronounce it properly. Oh,
Muhammad Kaba Saganugu.
yes, that's his name.
Yeah. He was enslaved in 1777. And he left from Bunce Island in the Sierra Leone River and then ended up in Jamaica. He ended up on a coffee plantation on the ridge that overlooks St. Elizabeth Parish in Manchester. At the time, initially, it wasn't, I don't think it was Manchester Parish, it was part of something else, but it became Manchester Parish. You know, I've been there several times, and done work there. Well, Muhammad Kaba Saganugu was a very well-educated Muslim, and he wrote a book from memory that's now in Oxford at the Bodleian Library, and he wrote it. We're not quite sure when, but sometime before 1820. He had not had access to any Arabic books or anything since he left Africa in 1777. And so he wrote from memory. A colleague of mine, a former student, a colleague of mine, Yassine Dadi Adoun, he and I have worked on this extensively, including going there to talk with the descendants of people that are there, because they're there today. Anyway, the owner of the plantation was a guy by the name of Peart, and so most of the descendants of people from that plantation, from that coffee estate, took the name Peart as a surname. The rest took the name Robinson because when the Mr. Peart died, and we have a portrait of him. When he died, his widow married somebody by the name of Robinson, and so that's why you have the two names. But the Peart side, well, he didn't die until Muhammad Kaba Saganugu died, and let me remember, I think it was.
He was about 90 when he died. He was an old man.
Yeah, well, he died, I think, in 1842.
Yeah, he's
He was
pretty
an
old.
old man.
Yes. Her name is Elizabeth Dolan. That's her name. She wrote an article.
Yes, so have I.
Yes. But interestingly, the Pearts.
Marine Water Lewis knows
Jamaica.
those.
She's from Trinidad, who's in Jamaica.
well, Maureen's my sister, so we do a lot.
Oh, you know Marine Wana Lewis well.
Extremely, and
Yes,
her husband
Rupert Lewis. Okay.
Very well, yeah. My wife and I were very good. We haven't seen him in a while, but since the pandemic, but nonetheless, we're very good friends with them. Yeah, yeah. These things happen, you know. Anyway.
But the Muhammad, that man from Africa, his descendants, the Pearts, they look phenotypically white. They're really light.
Muhammad Kaba Saganugu?
His descendants, the Pearts who were in politics, they
I
look
don't know
white.
any.
Oh, you don't know?
I know I don't. I don't know any. I don't know anymore because when I started working on this, it wasn't a main focus.
Okay.
And
okay.
Then it was, it's something like that novel that I told you about too. These things happen when you do research. Things jump out at you. And Muhammad Kaba Saganugu jumped out at me because most of my work has been on Islamic Africa.
I know.
And so I was really interested in. I mean, Muhammad Saganugu, a Kaaba clan of Muslims in West Africa are all Qadiriya. They belong to the Qadiriya Brotherhood.
I know
And
yes, yeah, when I was a student at UA, we were studying Islamic history, well, history in Africa, and why Islamic politics was violent in North Africa and not in West Africa. And I discovered that particular name. I can't pronounce it name. You said it.
Qadiri.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, well, Qadiriya, but in the language, so the sort of the plural, like people, is Qadiriya. So that's
yes,
all. And then later there's another brotherhood, the Tijaniya, that develops in the 19th century under Alhaj Omar Tal. And I write about this in my book on jihad, the jihad movement.
yes.
And the Saganugu uh, 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 Saganugu says that he really comes from um, he's a descendant of people actually that trace their ancestry back to ancient Ghana and Soninke rather than Mande, although they're all Mande by just because you can trace your ancestry back hundreds of years to something else. It doesn't mean that that's what you still are. You belong to the society you live in. And well, they lived in the Taraba River Valley and at a place called Buka, and he talks about it. He in the Arabic manuscript that he wrote, in one of the letters he wrote that has survived. He writes to another Muslim in Kingston, and he says, listen, when you write to me, use my real name, Muhammad Kabasaganugu. Don't call me Dick. My name's not Dick. That's what they call me here, but my name is Muhammad Kabasaganugu. So
Okay.
he tells us what his name is in the
And
manuscript.
he had how many children did he have? Do you know?
I don't know,
Okay, because I'm really
but
interested in
but it
knowing if his
really
descendants
seems
are the Pearts.
who knows how unusual or not, but it seems as if he had one wife his whole life. He had a family. He
Okay.
had a moral. He became Moravian because he couldn't practice Islam openly. He couldn't. He couldn't. But the Moravians, they didn't eat pork and they didn't drink. Huh? Well, that's cool. That's what we Muslims. We don't eat pork and we don't drink.
Yeah. No, look, and this is why I'm telling you, I really don't like Zoom because I have to close this link again. And I have
Okay.
so many questions to ask because I wanted to talk about slavery in Africa and a new book that's interesting. So let me close it and do a final link.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
try.